The air was still when I heard it, the deep, mechanical growl of engines, the kind of sound that doesn't belong on a quiet country morning. I stepped out of my farmhouse porch barefoot, the chill of dew-soaked grass clinging to my soles. And there they were, three bright yellow bulldozers rolling down the dirt road like armored beasts, their steel teeth glinting under the pale sunrise. For a moment I thought maybe I was dreaming, or worse, that they had taken a wrong turn. But no, those machines turned directly toward my barn. My barn. The building I had raised with my own hands 40 years ago. Beams cut from timber I milled myself. Walls that had sheltered livestock, harvests, and more memories than I could count. And standing in front of them, arms folded smugly across his chest, was he. 35 years old, hair slicked back like he thought he was some Wall Street prodigy, polished loafers sinking into my gravel drive. The HOA president. His name didn't even need to be spoken for bile to rise in my throat. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just nodded at the operator of the first bulldozer, like a general ordering troops into battle. The first crash shattered the morning silence. The machine rammed its blade into the barn wall, splintering wood with a sickening crack. I staggered forward, yelling, my throat raw, my words drowned out by the engine's roar. Dust erupted into the air, sharp with the scent of pine and hay, choking me as I tried to push past the workers. I caught sight of the villain's face, calm, calculated, almost bored, as if watching a man's history being reduced to rubble was just paperwork to him. "Stop! That's my property!" I bellowed, my fists pounding against the metal frame of the bulldozer. My palms stung, but the driver didn't even look at me. His orders were louder than mine. Boards groaned, the roof sagged, and within minutes, decades of sweat and labor caved inward. The barn collapsed into itself, the air filling with snapping beams and the shriek of nails tearing loose. A sound that stays in your bones long after you've stopped hearing it. I dropped to my knees in the dirt, coughing, my eyes watering not just from dust but from something heavier, deeper. That barn wasn't just wood and nails. It was where my children had played hide and seek, where I kept the tractor my father had left me, where generations of our family's hard work had lived, and now it was gone. When the dust cleared, the man finally spoke. His voice was smug, practiced, like he was reciting a script written by lawyers. Non-compliant structure, he said flatly. Hazardous. HOA board voted on it. Consider this. Resolved, resolved. I wanted to lunge at him, tear that smugness from his face. But all I could do was stare at the ruins, splinters jutting upward like gravestones, and feel my pulse hammering in my ears. My jaw clenched until my teeth hurt. The worst part? He turned his back on me, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked away as though I were nothing more than an obstacle already cleared. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Grief burned into rage, rage cooled into something sharper, more dangerous. They thought they had taken everything from me. They thought they could humiliate me, crush my spirit, leave me crawling in the dirt. But what they didn't know, what he didn't know, was that I still held the key to something far larger, something buried deep in the land, forgotten by time but not by me. A valve, one twist, and the pristine $5 million lake that their whole resort community revolved around. Their pride, their playground, their crown jewel, wouldn't exist by morning. So the question wasn't whether I would fight back. The question was, how far was I willing to go to make sure he and everyone standing behind him would never forget the cost of crossing me? I should probably start at the beginning, before the bulldozers and before the rage that settled like stone in my chest. My name's Thomas Hale. I'm 60 years old, though my back feels older most mornings. I've lived on this stretch of land longer than the slick-haired tyrant who calls himself an HOA president has even been alive. This place isn't just property to me. It's a legacy. My father bought the farm after returning from Vietnam, determined to give his children something solid, something rooted in the earth. I was born in that farmhouse, raised among the fields, and learned to fix tractors before I ever learned to drive a car. The barn, that barn, was where my father taught me how to build with my hands. We raised cattle under its beams, stored hay in its loft, and more than once I fell asleep on the bales after long harvest days. When my kids were young, it was their kingdom. Forts in the hay, secret hideouts, echoes of their laughter bouncing between wooden walls. You don't just lose a barn like that. You lose decades. You lose bloodlines. But life moved on. The farm shrank, neighbors sold off land, and slowly what had been a proud patchwork of family homesteads became something shinier, something artificial. Developers came in with brochures promising luxury country living. They carved up the land into parcels, built cookie-cutter homes with stone facades and plastic shutters, and to lure buyers, they dug a pristine lake right in the middle of it all. The crown jewel of the community, the pamphlet said, a $5 million water feature and resort centerpiece. And with it came the HOA. At first I didn't mind. They promised paved roads, snow removal, and maybe even security patrols. I figured, let them play king of their manicured lawns. I'd keep to my side of things. My house sat right on the edge of the association's boundary, my old farmhouse grandfathered into their maps. But my barn sat closer to the lake than they liked. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't symmetrical. And to them, that made it a problem. That's when I met him, Jared Connolly, 35, sharp jaw, teeth too white to be trusted, the kind of man who wears a suit jacket to a neighborhood barbecue just so people know he's important. He was the newly elected HOA president, and he wasted no time letting me know exactly how he saw me. The first time we spoke, he strolled up my driveway with two board members trailing behind him like bodyguards. He didn't bother with introductions. "Mr. Hale," he said, scanning my barn like a hawk circling a carcass, "this structure violates our community aesthetic." "Community aesthetic," I repeated, wiping grease off my hands from tuning the tractor. "It's a barn. Built in '82. Been here longer than your houses, longer than your lake?" He smiled thinly, like he'd been waiting for me to say that. "All the more reason to update things. We're cultivating a certain image here. Your barn—" He paused, gesturing like he was presenting a bad painting in an art gallery. "It doesn't fit." I laughed then. I actually laughed. "Son, this barn was here before you learned to tie your shoes. If anything doesn't fit, it's your plastic castles and your fake lake." His smile didn't falter, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Well, rules are rules. You'll be receiving notice." And I did. Letters, official-looking envelopes stamped with the HOA logo. Words like non-compliant structure, safety hazard, and failure to meet standards. They fined me. Fined me for paint that was peeling, for shingles that weren't uniform, even for having hay stacked outside for a few weeks in the summer. I ignored them at first, figured they'd get bored and move on, but they didn't. Jared had the bit between his teeth, and he pulled harder with each letter. The neighbors were no help. Some pitied me, whispered about how unfair it all seemed. But when push came to shove, they stayed quiet. Nobody wanted to risk fines or worse, getting on Jared's bad side. My daughter, Claire, came by one Sunday after another stack of fines had arrived. She's 32, a school teacher, strong-willed like her mother. She found me at the kitchen table with the letters spread out like losing cards in a poker hand. "Dad, you can't keep ignoring this," she said, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "I've lived here 60 years, I muttered. "This is our land. They can't tell me what to do with it." "They think they can," she said softly. "And you know what? They've got money and lawyers to back them up." I wanted to argue, but the truth sat heavily in my gut. She was right. Jared wasn't just a neighbor with an ego. He was a neighbor with power, and he was hell-bent on using it against me. I remember the last time I saw my barn fully intact, glowing in the late afternoon sun, its wood weathered but proud. I ran my hands along the rough boards, feeling the grooves my father's saw had left decades earlier. Something in me whispered that Jared wasn't going to stop, that one day he'd take more than fines and threats, and then of course he did. That's why the morning of the bulldozers wasn't a surprise, not really. It was more like a prophecy fulfilled. The last card played in a game I never wanted to sit down for. But here's what Jared never knew. That fancy lake he bragged about in brochures, the one where families held picnics and teenagers snuck out to swim at night. My father had told me its secret before he passed. That lake wasn't natural. It was fed by an old system of underground irrigation channels, with a main control valve tucked into a rusted shack half hidden in the woods. The kind of thing only a man who worked the land for decades would know. The kind of thing Jared, in all his arrogance, never even bothered to learn. And as I stood in the rubble of my barn, dust coating my tongue, rage carving lines deeper into my face, I realized something. He thought he had the upper hand. He thought bulldozers and bylaws made him untouchable. But he'd forgotten one simple truth. When you push a man who's got nothing left to lose, you'd better pray he doesn't remember where the valve is. When people talk about harassment, they usually picture loud confrontations, shouting matches, maybe fists thrown. Jared's kind of harassment was quieter. Paperwork, whispers, slow suffocation. He didn't come at me with fists. He came at me with bylaws. It started with the fines, and after the bulldozers came and left me with a pile of splinters where my barn once stood, I thought maybe he'd be satisfied. I thought maybe Jared had gotten the trophy he wanted. The old-timer put in his place, the blemish on his precious resort community erased. I was wrong. The week after the barn was leveled, another letter arrived. I nearly laughed when I opened it. A fine for excess debris visible from roadway. Debris. They'd torn down my barn, and now they were fining me for not sweeping away the wreckage fast enough. I crumpled the paper in my hands, heat rising in my chest. They wanted me to pay them for the privilege of being robbed. I didn't pay. That's when Jared himself came knocking. It was late evening, the sky bruised purple, cicadas buzzing in the trees. I was sitting on the porch nursing an old bottle of rye when headlights swept across my yard. His black SUV rolled up my gravel drive like it owned the place, tires crunching with smug authority. He stepped out wearing pressed slacks and a blazer like he was about to walk into a boardroom, not a farm. His shoes shone even in the dust. "Evening, Mr. Hale," he said smoothly, strolling up my porch steps without waiting for an invitation. "We need to discuss compliance." I didn't offer him a chair. "You mean the mess your bulldozers left?" "Yeah, I've been meaning to comply with a bonfire." His smile tightened. "You're racking up fines. Non-payment will lead to liens against your property." My fist clenched around the bottle. "This land isn't yours to take." "Oh, but it could be," he said, his voice like oil. "The board has authority to seize assets if dues and fines remain unpaid. That old farmhouse of yours, picturesque in a rustic way, could make a charming clubhouse extension." I stood so fast that the chair scraped against the wood. "You lay one finger on my house and I swear—" "Careful, Mr. Hale," he interrupted, smirking. "Threats don't look good in court." He left me standing there, blood boiling, fists trembling. His SUV's taillights disappeared down the road, but the echo of his words stayed long after the cicadas fell silent. The weeks blurred together, each one worse than the last. Letters piled up. Fines for uncut grass, never mind I just mowed. Fines for chipped paint on the fence. Fines for having an unapproved vehicle in the driveway. My tractor, the same tractor my father had left me. It wasn't just paper. Jared started sending board members to inspect my property, clipboards in hand, eyes darting like vultures. They'd wander too close to the house, peer into windows, jot down notes about violations. I caught one of them photographing my tool shed. When I demanded what he thought he was doing, he muttered documentation and scurried off. Neighbors began avoiding me. The Petersons, who used to wave when they drove by, now sped up past my lane. At community gatherings, I heard my name whispered, saw heads shake. Jared was spreading rumors that I was dangerous, unstable, that I'd threatened board members. He wanted me isolated, the cranky old farmer everyone wanted gone. My daughter Claire tried to keep me grounded. She came by with groceries, hugged me tighter each time. "Dad, they're trying to break you down." Don't let them, but nights grew long. I'd sit by the ruins of the barn, the smell of old hay and charred wood lingering, and feel the walls closing in. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me think of Jared's smug voice, his threats. I started locking every door, even in daylight. One night I found tire tracks leading off the gravel into my field, straight through rows of young corn. Someone had spun donuts in the soil, tearing up weeks of work. No note, no signature, but I knew who had allowed it. Jared wanted me angry, wanted me unstable. He got his wish. The next HOA meeting was held in their glossy clubhouse, all polished wood and fake chandeliers. Against Claire's advice, I showed up. I needed to look Jared in the eye. The room fell silent when I walked in. Folding chairs filled with neighbors shifted uneasily. Jared sat at the front like a king on his throne, gavel resting in his hand. He smirked as I took a seat in the back. The meeting dragged on. Landscaping budgets, pool rules, nonsense about approved mailbox colors. My patience wore thin. Finally, Jared cleared his throat. Last item, the matter of Mr. Hale's continued non-compliance. Heads turned. I felt the weight of every eye. Despite repeated notices, Jared went on, his voice smooth, rehearsed, Mr. Hale has failed to bring his property up to standard. The board proposes escalating action, including possible foreclosure proceedings. A murmur rippled through the room. My pulse roared in my ears. I stood. That's my land. My home. You can't steal it with your paperwork. Jared tapped his gavel once, smug. Order, please. Outbursts will not be tolerated, I laughed bitterly. Order? You demolished my barn. You fined me into the ground. And now you think you can take my house? He leaned forward, eyes gleaming. We don't think, Mr. Hale. We know the room fell into a hush. Even his allies shifted uncomfortably at the arrogance dripping from his words. But nobody spoke up. Fear kept them silent. I left that night shaking, fury and hopelessness twisting in my chest. Jared had won. He had the power, the board, the bylaws. And me? I was just an old man with splinters for memories. But then, 2 nights later, I found myself walking the old deer trail behind my property, moonlight spilling silver across the woods. My boots crunched leaves as I made my way to a half-forgotten shack, rusted tin roof sagging, vines crawling up its sides. Inside, cobwebs clung to the corners. The smell of damp earth filled my lungs. And there it was, the old steel valve, thick with rust but still solid. My father had shown it to me when I was a boy, explaining how the irrigation channels fed the lowland reservoir. The same channels developers had later expanded into their Resort Lake One twist. That's all it would take. I stood there in the moonlight, staring at the valve, my hand trembling inches from it. Part of me wanted to do it right then, drown their precious paradise in mud. But another part hesitated. Once I did this, there was no turning back. Still, as I stood in that shack, Jared's voice echoed in my skull. We don't think, we know. And I whispered into the dark, we'll see about that. From then on, everything Jared did only fed the fire. More fines, more rumors. One afternoon, I caught 2 of his inspectors actually stepping onto my porch, photographing the chipped paint around my window frames. I shouted until my throat burned, but they only shrugged, muttering, bored business. The last straw came when I received a certified letter. Notice of intent to foreclose. They were really doing it. They wanted my home, the last piece of my father's legacy. That night, as thunder rolled over the hills and rain lashed the farmhouse windows, I sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread before me. Claire sat across from me, her face pale, her hands trembling. Dad, she whispered, tears in her eyes, you can't fight them. They've got the law on their side. I looked at her, my heart aching at the fear in her voice. Then maybe it's time I stopped playing by their rules. Her brow furrowed. What do you mean? I didn't answer, but in my mind I saw the valve, rusted and waiting. I saw Jared's smug smile vanish, and I felt for the first time in months something close to hope. The morning of the final confrontation began deceptively quiet. Sunlight crept across my kitchen table, glinting off the certified foreclosure notice still sitting there. My coffee went cold as I stared at the paper, every word another nail in the coffin Jared was building for me. But this time, I didn't feel despair. I felt clarity. I knew what I was about to do. The HOA had scheduled another board meeting that afternoon, and Jared made sure every homeowner knew it. Flyers had been stuffed into mailboxes, emails blasted out, the subject line dripping with drama. Final resolution regarding non-compliance at Hale property. They wanted a spectacle. They were going to parade me like a criminal, strip me of dignity in front of my neighbors. Jared was going to make an example out of me, but I had a plan of my own. I spent the morning walking the woods, my boots sinking into damp earth. The air was heavy, clouds rolling low, as though the sky itself knew what was coming. When I reached the shack, my heart pounded with the rhythm of a war drum. The valve stood there, unchanged, like it had been waiting for me. Rust streaked its iron body, the wheel cold beneath my palm. I closed my eyes and thought of my father's voice. Respect the land, Tommy. It gives, it takes, and it remembers. Well, I whispered, so do I. With both hands I turned. At first the wheel resisted, groaning like an old man reluctant to move. But then it shifted, creaked, and spun with surprising ease. Deep beneath the ground I felt it, the shudder of ancient pipes waking, the rush of water redirecting. The lake had begun to bleed. By the time I arrived at the clubhouse, Jared was already holding court. The parking lot brimmed with SUVs, neighbors gathered in clusters, whispers buzzing. Inside, the fluorescent-lit hall hummed with tension. Folding chairs lined up in rows, everyone filled. At the front, Jared stood behind a podium, crisp suit and smug grin perfectly polished. He looked like a man ready to deliver a eulogy. For me. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying with ease, thank you for attending this important meeting. Today we address a matter that has threatened the integrity and beauty of our community, the ongoing non-compliance of Mr. Thomas Hale. Heads turned toward me as I entered. I felt their eyes like heat on my skin. Some looked away in guilt, others in curiosity, a few in outright disdain. But I walked steady, every step fueled by the knowledge of what was already happening beyond those walls. Jared smirked at my presence. Ah, Mr. Hale, thank you for joining us. Perhaps you'd like to say a few words before the board finalizes its decision? I stopped in the center of the room, hands clasped behind my back, voice steady. No words needed, Jared. I think actions will speak loud enough. A ripple of confusion ran through the crowd. Jared arched an eyebrow, clearly amused. Actions? Mr. Hale, the only action here is the board voting to foreclose on your property, effective immediately. He raised his gavel, tapped it lightly, and that sound echoed like a death knell. But then, a murmur broke out in the crowd. It started with one person near the back, then another. Heads turned, voices overlapping. People stood, peering out the wide clubhouse windows that faced the lake. Jared frowned. What is going on? I turned slowly, savoring the moment, and pointed. Take a look. Every chair scraped back as neighbors crowded the glass. Gasps filled the room. The pristine lake, their pride, their jewel, was shrinking before their very eyes. Water churned unnaturally, the shoreline pulling back like a curtain. Docks tilting as mud cracked beneath them. The glittering surface that once reflected the sky was collapsing into sludge. What the hell? Jared muttered, rushing to the window. His face went pale, color draining like the water outside. The room erupted. People shouted, hands flying to mouths, children tugging at their parents in confusion. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the chaos. That lake you built your paradise around? It's built on the same irrigation my father and I used to farm this land. I know its veins better than anyone, and I know where the heart valve is. Gasps, whispers, eyes wide. Jared spun, fury and panic tangled in his expression. You did this? I met his gaze, unflinching. You destroyed my barn. You tried to take my home. You wanted to erase my legacy, so I erased yours. The crowd fell into stunned silence. Jared's composure cracked. He slammed his palm against the podium, eyes wild. This man is confessing to sabotage, criminal sabotage. Do you hear this? But the crowd wasn't looking at me with hatred. They were looking at him. For the first time, they saw past the polished veneer. They saw the bully, the manipulator, the arrogant boy who thought he could play God with other people's lives. One older neighbor, Mrs. Whitfield, stood up, her voice trembling but clear. You tore down his barn. You lied to us. You said it was about safety, about rules, but it was about control. Others murmured in agreement. Someone shouted, "He's right! The lake was our pride, and you used it to control us." The tide turned faster than I could have dreamed. Jared's gavel clattered from his hand. "No, no, you don't understand. This is his fault. He destroyed the lake." But the words sounded weak, desperate. Neighbors began closing in, voices rising, not against me, against him. I stepped forward, standing taller than I had in years. "You thought you were untouchable, Jared. Thought you could bury me with fines and bylaws. But power's only as strong as the people who believe in it, and it looks like they don't believe in you anymore." The room shook with voices. "Resign! We trusted you. You ruined everything." Jared's face twisted, his slick-back hair damp with sweat. He looked less like a president and more like a cornered animal. And then the sound that sealed it all. Sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through the clubhouse windows as police cruisers pulled up outside. Someone must have called when the chaos erupted. Officers strode in, calm but commanding, hands resting near holsters. The lead officer scanned the room, then turned to Jared. "Mr. Connolly, we've had multiple reports of harassment, property destruction, and now mismanagement of association funds. We need you to come with us." The color drained entirely from his face. You can't. This is outrageous." But the cuffs clicked around his wrists, metal biting into the manicured image he'd built. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as their president was let out, his voice breaking into pitiful protests. The same man who once strutted with arrogance now looked small, powerless. And me? I stood in the center of it all, the weight of months of torment finally lifting. The lake outside lay in ruins, but I didn't feel regret. Sometimes you have to burn the field to save the soil. Sometimes you have to drain the lake to remind people what truly matters. The community was forever changed in that moment, but the story wasn't over yet. There would be rebuilding, reckoning, and reflection. Because while Jared had been dragged out in cuffs, I still had to face what I'd done and what it meant for my future. The morning after Jared was led away in handcuffs, I walked out onto my porch and breathed the kind of air I hadn't felt in months. Clean, light, untainted by dread. The cicadas still buzzed, the sun still rose, but something in the air had shifted. For the first time in a long while, the land felt like it belonged to me again. The lake, though, that was a different story. What had once been a gleaming centerpiece of brochures and real estate promises was now a muddy scar. Docks lay tilted at odd angles, boats stranded in cracked earth, fish flopping helplessly until the water receded completely. Neighbors gathered around its edges, muttering in disbelief, some angry, others strangely relieved, as though the illusion had finally broken, and they could see what had always been beneath the surface. Claire stood beside me, her hand resting on my arm. "Dad," she said softly, "you really did it." I nodded, my throat thick. Sometimes the only way to end a lie is to tear it down. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching. "Do you regret it?" I thought about that, about the barn, the fines, the nights I'd lain awake wondering how much more I could take. I thought about Jared's smirk, his arrogance, his cruelty, and I thought about the valve, turning under my hands, the roar of water slipping away. "No," I said finally, "not for a second." The fallout came quickly. News spread faster than wildfire. HOA president arrested after residents' property demolished. Luxury lake resort drained overnight. Reporters came sniffing around, cameras flashing, hungry for sound bites. I kept my answers short, let the facts speak for themselves. The board scrambled to recover, but without Jared pulling the strings, they were headless. Neighbors who'd once whispered and avoided me now knocked on my door, voices hushed, apologies spilling out. They admitted they'd been afraid, that Jared had threatened fines or worse if they spoke against him. I didn't absolve them. Fear doesn't excuse silence. But I didn't hold it too tight either. We'd all been caught in his web. The authorities dug deeper, and what they found was worse than I'd imagined. Embezzled funds, kickbacks from contractors, falsified records. Jared hadn't just been abusing power, he'd been lining his pockets with it. By the time the investigation wrapped, The man who thought himself untouchable was facing years behind bars. Justice in its own way had been served. As for me, I rebuilt. Not the barn, at least not right away. That pile of rubble became a strange kind of monument, a reminder of what I'd lost but also what I'd endured. Instead, I focused on the farmhouse, patching fences, repainting walls, and fixing shingles with my own hands. Work I could control, work that reminded me who I was. Claire came often, helping where she could, bringing her students handmade thank you cards after they heard Mr. Hale stood up to the bullies. Sometimes we laughed about it, sometimes we cried, but always we moved forward. And the land, my land, remembered. The fields grew strong that summer, the soil rich and generous, as if it too had shed the weight of Jared's arrogance. One evening, months later, the community gathered, not in the clubhouse but in the open field where the lake used to shimmer. The sun dipped low, painting the sky gold, the cracked basin stretching out like a scar healed over. People brought folding chairs, kids ran barefoot in the mud, and for the first time since all of it began, neighbors spoke to one another without fear. Mrs. Whitfield, the same woman who'd stood up during the meeting, approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice trembling, "you saved us. You showed us we didn't have to live under his thumb." I shook my head. "I didn't save you. I just stopped being afraid. The rest was up to you." She smiled through her tears. "Maybe, but sometimes it takes one man's courage to remind the rest of us we still have ours." Those words stayed with me. Now when I sit on my porch at dusk, I don't look at the ruins of my barn or the dried bed of the lake with bitterness. I see them for what they are, reminders. That power, when unchecked, is dangerous. That silence only feeds bullies. That dignity is worth more than money, more than appearances, more than anything a man like Jared could take. The community has begun planning what to do with the lake bed. Some talk about turning it into gardens, walking trails, something real and useful instead of a glittering illusion. I don't know what they'll decide, and honestly, I don't need to, because my fight is over. I won't pretend there weren't costs. The barn is gone, the land carries scars, and my trusted neighbors will never be the same. But when I think of Jared, sitting in a cold cell far from his manicured lawns, stripped of his titles and his smug grin, I feel peace. They destroyed my barn, but I destroyed his empire. And in the end, I learned something my father always knew. Land can be rebuilt, homes can be repaired, but dignity, once taken, must be fought for tooth and nail. I fought and I won. That's the legacy I'll leave behind.